When browsing my social media, I tend to come across some rather vague comments. How do I get good at building? How do I start building? How do I build like that? How? The short answer is that I've been building for 8 years, I love learning, I practice a lot, and I haven't gone outside since August 2021, and the long answer is... Basically everything in this video is my own opinion. Please disagree with me in the comments, it helps boost engagement. In this video I will be covering the game's limitations and how to work with them, a range of advanced techniques to elevate your skill set, creative building tools, building categories and styles, and finally, having a strong mindset. If by the end of the video you think that I've delivered on this statement, I'd really appreciate a like. Let's start with the basics. Fundamentally, the Minecraft world is made of blocks. Most blocks are lovely cubes, as you may know, but there are a fair few irregular ones that make excellent shapes for building. And even with these nice shapes, we still lack perfect slopes, curves, and diagonals. Therefore, one of your first obstacles to overcome is understanding how to recreate these rather awkward forms in our block game. I'll cover some tools that can help you with this later, but early on you should play around with making circles by hand, especially those with odd numbered diameters. Make good use of the non-full blocks such as walls, trapdoors, and fence gates. Once you understand circles, you essentially unlock curves and arches. Another limitation when it comes to Minecraft is colour. While there is indeed an incredible range of available textures, not all colours have the array of shapes given by those such as the woods and stones. Seriously Mojang, where are my blue never breaks? One way that we can fill in some of these colour gaps is by using a technique called glass shading. Simply placing a glass block or pane over another block in order to slightly alter its hue. This can be incredibly useful for those tricky gradient transitions. And while we're on the topic of glass panes, these make excellent coloured shaping blocks if you think about them a bit like vertical slabs. A basic limitation to be aware of is the world height limit. In a void world you have 384 blocks available to use. It's likely not something that you'll have to worry about when you're starting out, but it is a game mechanic, so I thought it was worth mentioning. When I was learning how to build, I watched a lot of tutorials, so the fact that you've made it here is a great sign. Good job. Following a block for block tutorial will allow you to pick up a few techniques, but in my opinion it's not a valuable way of learning how to build for yourself. And this is why I tend to present my own tutorials more as methodology guides. An important skill to master early on is the ability to work from a reference. Essentially, it's a substitution. You can worry less about composition and shaping because, well, the artist has already done that hard work for you. But you have to put more effort into recreating the details and textures in a new medium. Lately I've been using Pinterest to find some inspiration, and I'll show some comparisons of my builds against the images that I was working off of. Depending on what you're building, you'll either want to recreate the reference or to put your own creative spin on the concept. It's a fun challenge to transfer the shapes and colours into our block game. You can also of course reference other builders' creations. Just be super mindful of any plagiarism, unintentional or otherwise. Remember that you're likely to learn less if you straight up copy someone else's Minecraft project. Alright, let's actually start building, since that's why you're here. Here's a flat wall, but it's rather bland, so let's take a look at a few texturing techniques. Texturing boils down to introducing block variation. Since Minecraft blocks already have their own textures, when building we're applying texture on the macro level, mostly by varying colour. I use this handy image that I'm calling my omnidirectional gradient colour wheel to find blocks with similar colours, and this image is pinned on my Instagram profile if you'd like to take a closer look. Please follow. For my first example, I'll simply take a couple extra blocks from the same colour group and randomly replace sections of the wall. This is obviously an improvement, but it can look quite messy overall, more evidently at a larger scale. Therefore, another way to texture is to group your blocks together more, and to have more clear transitions between different blocks. This method is particularly effective for roofs and larger walls, where you might apply a gradient in a certain direction. Additionally, this technique can be used to emphasize areas in shadow, by moving towards slightly darker blocks where you want the build to appear darker. Another example is to introduce grimy texturing, where you can imagine that water has been dripping down a wall over time. Great for abandoned or dystopian style builds. You can achieve this by adding a gradient that is more dark, or brown, or green, and this method can be utilized alongside other texturing techniques as well. We've also got patterns texturing, wherein you apply a regularly repeating design in order to punctuate geometric shapes, like these pillars, or equally to diversify a gradient. Pro tip, don't use hue blocks for your gradients. Next, I'll touch on detailing. I would define detailing in Minecraft as using the non-full blocks to improve shaping and intricacy on the micro level. I usually approach detailing towards the end of a build, once I've got the major shaping down with full blocks. Don't be afraid to use functional blocks as decorative ones. Candles can be candles, but they can also be spray cans, handlebars, aerials, and leaves. Fence gates can go in a fence, but they can also go in roof underhangs, tree branches, and starfighter gun barrels. I could go on, but you get the idea. Thinking outside the box while keeping your designs recognizable is a key skill that you'll develop over time. You can also use the debug stick to get some crazy details, although this obviously prevents a creation from being survival friendly. It's definitely fun to play around with it though, especially when combined with a model plugin that prevents block updates, because it simply allows you to reach a whole new level of detail. I've shown this color wheel already, but I think that it's a really handy tool and I do use it all the time. Obviously, it's not perfect, as it lacks a lot of monochromatic gradients, such as this one. Color theory is a useful concept to be aware of if you're looking to use Minecraft as an art form, but honestly, I'm not an expert in this department. Generally, warm colors such as red, orange, and yellow are rather intense and great for highlights. On the other hand, cool colors such as green, blue, and purple are more tame and natural. Having a balance of these is something to consider, but it's not always going to be applicable to what you're working on. In terms of making your creation look visually appealing, builders sometimes use shaders. This strays slightly from vanilla since you can heavily alter aspects like saturation and sky color, but the positive impact on presentability makes it widely acceptable. To take a good screenshot, get the sun behind you and turn that field of view right down. Some builders like to use texture packs, however personally I enjoy the challenge of working with what the game has given us. You can also learn rendering, which is a lengthy yet rewarding ordeal. In terms of composition, there are many interesting ideas like the rule of thirds and off-centering that you can research. I think that it's also great when your screenshot tells a story, as it engages the viewer. For example, here's a pretty cool X-Wing, but here's a swampy X-Wing getting lifted out of the water by a Jedi. Seems a bit more interesting, right? After working with a bunch of different creators, I can confirm that everyone has a process. Some people like to jump straight in with the shaping, while others will study a reference, whilst meticulously arranging several block palettes. Both approaches are perfectly okay, and you'll gradually establish your own workflow as you continue to build. Once you've found a process that works for you, try to stick to that system. My number one tip would be to just practice. You'll hear this a lot, but it's true. Put some hours in. If you're not completely sure on how to go about something, just give it a go. You can always improve it later or blow it all up and try again with more knowledge than before. For me, the hardest part of a build can be placing the first block. From there, the creativity starts to flow and the idea starts to materialize. After all these years, I have a sort of intuition when it comes to building because I'm aware of all the different techniques and concepts at my disposal, and how I can apply them in the best possible way. That is something that will only come with time. The most well-known building mod is World Edit, a fundamental tool for creative efficiency. Commands like stack, move, copy-paste, rotate, flip, and replace allow you to instantly complete tasks that would otherwise take hours if done by hand. There's a range of useful masks, brushes, and masks for brushes, which when mastered will streamline your process. I have a complete guide to World Edit on my channel, but please don't watch it now. Watch it after this one. 4, not to be confused with the number of IRL friends that I have, is build speak for fast async World Edit. I know that some people pronounce it Fowie, but that would have ruined the joke. It's the plugin version of World Edit, which means that it can be used on servers that have it installed. It comes with a fair few extra features and runs a lot more smoothly. With World Edit comes a rabbit hole of mathematically terrifying commands via / generate. And there's a handy 125-page guide for that if you're interested, linked in the description. Axiom is a relatively new mod set to take over the single-player creative building space, with numerous quality of life additions including hotbar swapping, fly speed toggling, force placing, fast braking, and block chiseling. It also comes with an incredibly comprehensive editor UI, which after you've spent a week getting used to the camera controls, will allow you to play around with blueprints, shapes, smoothing, text, height mapping, and noise pattern texturing, to name but a few features. You can even undo any mistakes with Ctrl-Z. Axiom does have a plugin version, however currently in my opinion it is outclassed by the other building plugins available. This could for sure change in the future though. Voxel Sniper is a building plugin that brings even more brushes to the table. Simply specify the material and brush shape, then adjust the brush size, intensity, and other parameters. Meta Brushes is a premium plugin that uses Voxel Sniper as its base. This adds even more brushes that are pretty meta for landscaping. See what I did there? GoBrush, another building plugin, is a height map terraforming tool. It comes with a snazzy menu, accessed via the Flint item. In here we can change the height map, size, intensity, direction up or down, and toggle a flattening mode. You can even add custom height maps. Then we've got GoPaint, an excellent tool for, you guessed it, painting. The menu lives in the feather. From here we can adjust the block we're painting with and on, as well as the size. There are also a few brushes, including a default sphere, a splatter brush, an angle masker, and a gradient placer. This plugin isn't super necessary because most of these brushes can be replicated in 4. However, it is a lot more simple, so I'd recommend using it if you're just starting out. And finally we have Archeon, an incredibly powerful plugin. You can replace by color, make spikes, and generate large-scale terrain in seconds. It also lets you replace entire block types with one command, form completely customizable boulders, and make use of probably the best command ever, Loft. And again, that's just scratching the surface. Archeon and Meta Brushes are unfortunately paywalled, but you can use them for free on public creative building servers, such as the Bakery. You can join their Discord to learn more, link below. Minecraft building can be broken down into 3 major categories. We've got structures, which are all the types of buildings, terrain, which is all about landscapes, and finally organics, which are usually upscaled creatures or humanoid figures. Note that this categorization is subjective. Vehicles, for example, tend to have organic shapes, but can also have structural interiors, and trees, despite being organic in nature, can be major components of terrain. In terms of structures, builders like to further categorize them into building styles. These can be defined as a set of characteristic features from a certain time period, region, or genre, or mirror real-life architectural styles. Styles can be as broad as medieval, or as narrow and detailed as modern eco-brutalist or dystopian cyberpunk oriental. Some people will dox you for inaccurately defining medieval though, so do be careful out there. Once you've decided on your style, you might find it best to start with a plan. You might want to lay down some palettes for different sections, for example, one for the wall gradient, one for the roof gradient, and one for the trim and detail blocks. If you're building from a reference like discussed before, you'll need to choose a scale to build at. For structures, the easiest way to do this is to scale off of the front door, or a window. My planning typically involves laying down an outline along the ground, but sometimes I go straight into boxing out the shapes. Typically I stick to odd-numbered whips so that I have one wide centers for roofs and circles. Avoiding a single rectangle for your base shape is key. Working up from a more complex base will lead to a more complex and hopefully more aesthetically pleasing structure. You can even make walls along the 45-degree angle for an extra challenge. Then I'll move on to shaping. This just means blocking out the walls and spending some time getting the roofs looking fancy. I would stick to just a handful of blocks so that you can worry about proper texturing later on. Staircase roofs can look a bit boring, so you might want to experiment with sharper angles, curves, domes, and cones, or to break up these shapes with dormers, spires, and chimneys. With your flat walls, you can push back sections to create some depth, generating more space to detail later. With multiple stories, you can play with overhangs, porches, and balconies in order to introduce some height variation, perhaps having roofs start and end at different levels, and taking advantage of a complex base shape. Once you're happy with the overall shape of the structure, it's texturing time. This is an opportunity to apply the techniques discussed earlier. A flat wall or roof can be made more interesting with a fun gradient, and with that you can think about shadows and shading. Pro tip, you can save your favorite gradients as hotbars in the creative menu. Pattern texturing can be used to highlight your shapes, maybe something as simple as this corner brickwork texture. If the theme permits it, work in some green or brown for some wear and tear. Be sure to utilize unique textures wherever possible. The back of the blast furnace is great for sci-fi, whilst the barrel fits perfectly in a medieval beam. Done with texturing? Now we can detail the structure, and yes, that includes the back. Your roofs and windows are going to want a nice trim and a contrasting colour to emphasize their shapes. The roof itself might need some smoothing out. Add some greenery, hanging lights, roof toppers, big signs, supports, essentially anything that isn't a full block is fair game. Throw in your open fence gates, campfires, lecterns, and trapdoors. However, there is certainly a balance for your detailing. Too much and you hide your excellent texturing behind a clunky mess, but too little and your build lacks life. And of course, I've laid out my process in this order, but your workflow might not follow it completely, and that's okay. It might make more sense to run through the whole process in one area, before moving on to the next, or to add some details before the texturing so that you know it will look nice in the end. Now, the average structure builder seems to fear interiors, and yet they already possess the fundamental skills necessary to do a great job. Introduce depth to the walls and ceilings, experiment with details, and use clever texturing. There's a rather unique opportunity to play with the bottom textures of certain blocks, such as the loom. Think about what objects might belong in a given room, and then attempt to recreate them in-game. Scattering turtle eggs and sea pickles around can look really good for some reason, so when in doubt you can always try that. To start in organic, I think that it's really important to use a reference, simply because of how tricky the shapes can get. When modelling animals, if you get the ratios and proportions of the body parts wrong, it's usually easy for the average person to tell just by eye. Finding a 3D model online can be really useful when you need to look at multiple angles. No joke, this was me when figuring out my light cruiser. So there are a couple ways that you can go about the actual shaping. Number one is wireframing, usually done by hand. You could also call this outlining in 3D. The best way to demonstrate this is via an example, so here's the timelapse of me wiring this dragon skull, and here's the reference that I was using. As you can see, I used different coloured lines to map out the different shapes on the image, and then used the same coloured wall blocks in-game. Another method is using commands. For a larger project, organic builders will use a lot of voxel sniper brushes, starting with the ball brush and then using the blend ball, and metabrush's metaball, to smooth everything out. Archeon's Loft is a great tool for quickly making cloth, wings, or sails. It's actually what I use for these dragon wings. Of course, it's still important to perfect your shaping by hand. Using these commands makes your building more efficient, but it doesn't take away from the skill of the creation. Generally, try to avoid staircasing because it can look too blocky, and also to avoid singular hanging blocks like this. In terms of scale, the larger you build, the easier it becomes to detail, but the more time you have to put in. Texturing organics tends to be very gradient based, especially on the large scale. On the smaller scale, detailing becomes very important in order to recreate intricate shapes. Oh, and don't forget about using glass shading and shaping. Alright, terrain time. If you're terraforming by hand, the best approach is probably the wireframing technique that I went over earlier. But building by hand is cringe, so let's see what commands we can use. I'll start by saying that I already have a couple tutorials on different advanced terrain techniques, which you can watch after this one. For shaping, we have the whole of the GoBrush plugin to work with, Metabrush's angled glyph, which is super useful, and Archeon's arc boulder. Archeon's Loft can also be used for cliffs as well as for rivers if you master air and use the D flag, which makes it stack down to the floor. Archeon's TerraGen is an insane command which generates a region of terrain given a certain noise pattern, and there are a lot of noise patterns to choose from. TerraGen works with all of the levels of water, and both Loft and TerraGen work with half slabs. You can texture your terrain by angle, through noise patterns, via masking to adjacent blocks, or a mixture of these. Personally, I like to replace the angles between 0 and 50 degrees in my grass, and then to apply a funky noise pattern to the remaining rock. I would love to cover this in more detail, but this video is getting pretty long, so you can always check out my other tutorials when you have the time. Unless you're building Mars, your terrain is going to look pretty barren without some trees. For your trees, start thick at the roots and then get narrower towards the middle, then open out again with branches. Smooth out your trunk with shaping blocks, making sure that the colours match up, and then use fences and fence gates for the branches. My number one tip for the leaves is to include more air gaps than you think that you'll need, because that makes it look more bushy and realistic. If you're making a giant tree, definitely think of it more as an organic and go for the voxel sniper brushes route, or use Archeon's spike command. For the leaves, you can opt for a sphere brush of mostly air, or alternatively you can build a few giant leaf assets and paste them around the branches. If you're making a dead tree, really focus on the detailing of the branches because they won't be covered by leaves. Obviously, because it's dead. Try to keep a positive mentality when attempting building. I get really upset when I read people saying, "I'll never be that good," when they see an awesome creation. If you set yourself up for failure like that, then it's true, you'll simply never improve. Instead, when looking at a build that's above your caliber, so to speak, try to think about what techniques have been used to make it look good. You'll certainly recognize at least one thing that I've talked about today, or I've done a terrible job. Staying motivated to keep building can understandably be difficult. There's a surprisingly steep learning curve, and getting good simply won't happen overnight. Not to get philosophical, but like with everything in life, if you set your mind to it, apply yourself and practice, you will improve, and seeing that improvement should hopefully be the motivation that you need. As a creator, all of your lovely comments are enough to keep me going, and I'm really indebted to you guys for that. So perhaps posting your own creations could be a motivator. You could join my community Discord server and post them there. I think that it'll be fitting to round off this video with a hyper-analysis of one of my own builds. I've chosen this small-scale organic named eyeball tree, because it's one of my more popular creations from my Instagram. Your first thought might be, wow Tom, you're so creative, how did you come up with that? And the answer's easy, I didn't. This guy did, here's my reference. I think the real skill demonstrated here is how I was able to transfer this idea into Minecraft. So I'll go through some of the techniques that I used. For the base shape I used wall edit to form a nice sphere for the eyeball. Next I had a look at the reference and started texturing the iris and pupil. I used a lot of light blue glazed terracotta because it was perfect for recreating the lines found in the iris. To replicate the white highlights on the eye, I used white blocks detailed with an iron trapdoor and some glass shading. Then I needed a white to red gradient, so I studied my colour wheel, making good use of the new cherry blocks. These red veins may look rather complicated, but it's really just spamming all of the mangrove detail blocks together, making sure that everything stays connected and gets thicker towards the top. I even threw in some red candles for extra detail. As the veins became roots, I needed a new gradient to transition from red to brown, which I accomplished through brown wool. The trunk itself is a semicircle. I mentioned at the start of the video that learning how to make circles is a really useful skill, and here's an example of that. I layered this curve and then textured it with brown blocks, mostly from the spruce family, detailing with open fence gates, mushrooms on podzol, and brown candles. As for the branches, this is a technique that I use all the time for making trees, covered in my first ever tutorial. I branched out with fences and fence gates, then used a world edit sphere brush mostly composed of air to paint in the leaves. After replacing the blocks with various green ones, I replaced the air above the moss blocks with grass and the air below them with cave vines. Analysing builds like this is something that I would love to continue as its own series, so let me know if you'd be interested in that. I could talk about what makes a build good for a scary amount of time, and it would be interesting to go over other people's builds as well. My satisfying time lapses are splendid, but they often don't quite reveal the planning process and many challenges overcome to reach a finished product. Therefore, I hope this video has been useful. Tackling all of building in one video was never going to be easy, and it certainly could never cover everything. But if you learnt just one thing, I'd appreciate a sub. Stick around for the bloopers and share this with a friend whom you think might benefit from it. All build downloads are on my Patreon. Thank you so much for watching. Note that this categorization, bro, who invented that? The best way to demonstrate this is via an example, so here's the time-lapse of me wiring framing. Why am I in that? We'll study a reference whilst meticulously, God.
Peppa Pig.